Excellent. And then over to you, Sue. Thank you, Sue.
Okay, good to see you all again. So we are in 2 Samuel chapter 15 today. So you want to turn that up, although we'll actually just look a little bit at the end of chapter 14 to start with, because that's where Anne led us to last week. So end of chapter 14, chapter 15 of 2 Samuel. So I was thinking that it can be quite easy for us to get caught up in all the plots and the goings on of what we read and sort of try to focus on who's doing what and where, and actually perhaps sometimes wonder, what the relevance is for us. So I think it's quite important that we look for God's hand in what we study, because obviously it is his word to us, and it's not just a good or a distressing or whatever story. And I think back of it always I have to remind myself, and in the current times and everything, God is working his purposes out. However complicated life may seem, however things, God is working his purposes out. I think we have to hold on to that, don't we? Okay, so then let's just think back to the last couple of weeks. And remember, we saw how King David's third son, Absalom, had escaped to Geshur after killing his half-brother Amnon. And last week, we learned about the scheme to get him back to Jerusalem, where his father, King David, was. And we saw last week in verses 23 and 24, how with Joab's help, Joab was the commander of the army, remember, Absalom returned to live in Jerusalem, but he lived in his own house. He wasn't in the palace with the king. And we also learned something else about Absalom last week. If you look back at verses 25 and 26, chapter 14, what did we learn about him?
I put that he's full
Handsome.
of himself. Handsome, yeah.
Handsome, yeah. Thick hair, much admired. And I guess he was probably in his 20s, was he? He was a handsome young man. And of course, remember, David by this time was getting quite a bit older, not the young man he was in his youth. Okay, so we read, I think it's somewhere in there, 27, that for 2 years, David refused to see Absalom. And this time, Joab refused to help Absalom get to see his father. So if you remember what Absalom did, he set fire to Joab's field so that Joab would have to come out and see what was going on. So therefore they met. And if you like to look at verses 32 and 33, can somebody just read those 2 verses for us? 32 and 33 of chapter 14.
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you.
32 and 33.
Yeah.
Absalom said to Joab, "Look, I sent word to you and said, come here so that I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me if I was still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death." So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down and with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom.
Okay, so it would appear at face value, if you look at that there, that David and Absalom are reconciled. Remember, David has never punished Absalom for his for murdering his half-brother, but it seems that they're at least back together again now. So we move into chapter 15. And can somebody read verses 1 to 12 for us, please?
I will, if you like.
Thanks, Julie.
It's headed up Absalom's Conspiracy in my Bible. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses, and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that he receives justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way towards all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Giloah, his hometown, and so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing.
Okay. So
Mm.
in verse 6, we just read that Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. So let's look at how he did this then. So the first 5 verses, what's Absalom, what's he doing? He's living in Jerusalem, remember? He's sort of made up with the king. And what's he doing?
Promoting himself, and he's surrounding himself with men and chariots and horses, all the things that you associate with a powerful man.
Okay, yeah, he is. And then what's he doing with all these things? What's he go on to do?
Sort of wants to become king, doesn't he? King, so he takes over a lot of what the king should be doing.
Okay, he takes over a lot of what the king should be doing. So where does he go in verse 2? Where's he going to?
Road leading to the city gate.
Okay, the road leading to the city gate. And remember, in those days, they had the great big archways and meeting places at the city gate. And that was where people came to do their business and just to meet one another and catch up. So the people the Israelites who were coming up to Jerusalem, perhaps to take a case to the king, were met by Absalom. And what did he say to them?
There's
no one to listen to you. There's no one to listen to you in your complaints.
Well, that's what Absalom said, isn't it? Yes, that's what he told them. When he met the Israelites, what did he ask them?
Where did you come from?
Yeah, where they came from, yeah. And they would say they were from one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said, this is verse 3 now, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And he added, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me and I would receive that they receive justice." So how would you describe, what words describe what he's doing?
He was making a case for himself that he should be king.
He was, wasn't he? And
He was undermining the king as well, wasn't he, by doing that?
Yes,
And the king's authority, yeah.
absolutely.
And not being truthful as well.
And he's not, yeah, Hazel, say that again.
Not being truthful.
In what way?
In by saying that there wasn't anyone that could answer his, that he could go, any of these people could go to.
Yeah, he was completely trying to undermine the authority of the king and get in first. He was quite happy to get up early to be there to meet them. And look at all his things he's saying. Does he actually help anyone?
Not that I can see.
No,
He doesn't actually do anything, does he, in terms of taking up their cases?
He was
So-
just gathering people, wasn't he? He was getting more and more people to get on his side.
Sort of stirring them up, wasn't he?
Mhm.
You know, if only I was the judge, I'd be far better than the one we've got now. So it's like sowing seeds of discontent, I guess.
well, he took hold of their hands and kissed them as much to say you're very welcome. If only
Yeah,
it were
yeah.
me you'd come to see.
Yeah, he was a real flatterer, wasn't he?
Mm.
Knew how to get round the people. I won't ask for examples, but you know, that way of behaving is perhaps evident, you know, I hate to say it, but among politicians and that, perhaps we see people who try to get on side, they make promises, they flatter, but maybe they don't actually sometimes actually do anything. It's all sort of all words, isn't it? All gush. And there he is, this handsome man making these, you know, these promises or suggestions as to what he could do.
Telling them what
So-
they want to hear.
Yeah,
basically.
tell them what they want to hear. I mean,
Yeah.
what sort of words describe that sort of behaviour? I mean, what sort of man is he?
It's manipulating.
Manipulating, very much so.
I think he's
Right.
puffed up with his own self-importance.
Puffed up with his own self-importance, yeah, proud, yes. Yeah. Anything else come to mind?
He's using his good looks to charm people. You know, I think someone's already
A
said that.
charmer, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I put down his, go on.
He's giving an illusion. He's
Yes.
pretending to be a man of the people, but it's just an illusion and an image.
Wow, yes, yeah, yeah.
And they all fell for it.
We'll see that in a minute, won't we? Yeah. So he was very scheming, wasn't he? He's, you know, very, oh dear. Do we like him? I don't. That sort of person.
Marmee comes to mind.
Yes,
Right.
I've got 4 words I wrote down:
Yeah.
manipulative, scheming, smarmy, flatterer.
Yeah.
So, and we've got those. Perhaps,
he
yeah.
probably picked on the vulnerable as well.
yeah. Well, I guess that's true, isn't it? Because the vulnerable people were coming up to the city with a complaint or something to meet the king. So they would have had something that made them vulnerable. I think that's a good insight. Okay, so verse 7, how long does Absalom keep this up for?
4 years.
4 years.
Yeah.
4 years, absolutely, quite a long time.
Mm.
And what does he then ask David?
Wants David to allow him to go to Hebron because he made a
Okay.
vow and he wants to honour that vow that he made to
Okay.
the Lord.
So he wants to go to Hebron. Now, Hebron is the town to the south of Jerusalem. It was the former capital of Judah. And we read way back in 2 Samuel chapter 2 that it's where David was anointed. So, you know, before Jerusalem came, Hebron was the place to go. And it now seems that Absalom is wanting to go there. And why does he say he wants to go? I think Leslie just said, but
Fulfill a vow.
you fulfill a vow.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I made a vow.
Yep, that's what he's saying, isn't it? And how does David respond? Verse 9.
He let him go.
Go in peace.
Yeah, he sent him in peace, didn't he? Go in peace. He let Absalom go to Hebron.
Well, he said he wanted to go and worship the Lord, didn't he? So that
He
sounded
said-
good, I suppose, didn't it?
It did indeed, didn't it? Yes, he said he knew how to get to David. I need to go there. I made a vow to the Lord. But he, I mean, it doesn't say whether he actually had or not. We don't know, but we can perhaps, we're left to knowing his character to wonder whether that perhaps was true or not. Anyway, he wanted to get to
Something
Hebron.
else. Probably
And,
because he knows that he wants to hear them type of things from his children. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right, Michelle. So Absalom goes to Hebron, verse Yeah, so verse 10, he's there. So what happens once he gets there? What's he do once he gets to Hebron?
He said Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, as soon as you hear the sound of trumpet, then say Absalom is king in Hebron.
Wow. Bit cheeky. Yeah, he sent messages round. As soon as you hear the trumpet blowing, you know, this is how the messages got round. You ought to declare Absalom as king.
Basically, I think he had a hidden agenda.
I think that might well be how he would describe it, a hidden agenda that's been coming out into the open here, isn't it? And he'd worked the people of Israel. He'd stolen their hearts, we read earlier. So when they heard the trumpets, and that's what they were to do, the likelihood is that they would go ahead with that. In verse 11, who else was there?
200 men had accompanied him.
Right, and what was their part in all this?
They weren't quite sure. They were just innocent.
Okay, so why had they gone with Absalom to Hebron?
They were just guests, weren't they? As guests, they went along.
Yeah, they were invited to go with on this special mission that Absalom was going.
You wonder how David could be so sort of ignorant of the fact that all this was going on, don't you? What was he doing all this time then?
Yeah, he obviously, yeah, he saw good in Absalom and wanted to believe him, didn't he? Okay, so these people in verse 11 who went knew nothing of the conspiracy, so they were tricked, weren't they, into going along. And when they got there, they sort of found themselves up in all of this. And then in verse 12, what does Absalom do? Two things.
He was offering sacrifices, but also he sent for Ahithophel, David's counselor, to come.
Yes.
Okay, so Ahithophel was David's chief advisor, and he'd been with David a long time. He was his friend. So Absalom knew here that this was an important person, so he sent for Ahithophel, and so Ahithophel came as well. So you see that Absalom has surrounded himself here with a lot of people,
a lot of official people.
Official people, yeah, people who would have been in David's court, absolutely, and people who would have proclaimed David as king.
I think, Sue, I think wasn't Ahithophel also Bathsheba's grandfather?
Indeed he was. Indeed he was. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's all within the yeah. So work that one out. So Ahithophel's son, I think, had Bathsheba, and Bathsheba was the one whose husband was then killed so that he could become David's wife. And that's so there is a history here, isn't there? A little bit knowing of the background of that, yeah. And so what happened to end of verse 12 there? What do we see was happening as a result of all this scheming?
More and more people started to follow him, Absalom.
That's right. And it says the conspiracy, because that's what it was, gained strength. Okay. So that's what's been happening out in down in Hebron now. So I feel like this film. Meanwhile, back at the palace in Jerusalem, let's see what's going on back there. So if somebody would read 13 to 29, please.
My goodness.
Is that too much to read? I'll split it in two. I'm happy to split it then.
I'll go from verse 13 down to
at 21.
21. Okay, then.
Or 20. Yeah.
Yeah. It says David flees. A messenger came and told David, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword. The king's officials answered him, your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses. The king set out with his entire household following him, and he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at a place some distance away. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath, marched before the king. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You're a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You only came yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us when I do not know where I'm going? Go back and take your countrymen. May kindness and faithfulness be with you.
Okay, so go on,
oh, sorry.
Yeah, so somebody'd like to just read the last bit from 21 to 29 then?
Okay.
Let's do
Who
that.
offered to do that?
I'll do it. Was it
Thanks.
from 21?
Yeah, 21 down to 29.
But Ittai replied to the king, as surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be. David said to Ittai, go ahead, march on. So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on towards the desert. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. The king also said to Zadok the priest, aren't you a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan, son of Abiathar. You and Abiathar take your 2 sons with you. I will wait at the fords in the desert until word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there.
Okay, so back in Jerusalem, having been in Hebron, verses 16 and 17, we read how David decided to leave the palace quite quickly. He heard the news and decided to leave. So who set out with him?
His entire household.
Yeah.
Everybody, practically everybody.
Practically everybody. He left some women behind. Who were they?
Concubines.
10 concubines.
Left behind to take care of the palace. Yeah. Yeah. And all his men marched past him, says, plus the Kerethites and Pelethites, and all the Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath. So this is really referring back to David's time when he was sojourning with the Philistines, when he was on the run from Saul quite a long time before. So remember, he'd taken up camp with the Philistines, and these are some of the people who would have come from that time. So they weren't Israelites, but they were supporters of David and loyal to him. So, I mean, the Bible quite a few times, I think we see examples of how God would welcome people from outside the Jewish faith if they wanted to honour him as God. We can think of Rahab, we can think of perhaps Ruth the Moabitess. And here we've got people who wanted to follow David, and they seem to be, well, they followed David, but they seem to have acknowledged his God as God. Okay, verse 19, I think, is quite interesting. How does David now refer to Absalom?
King.
What was that?
As a king, King Absalom.
King Absalom, yeah. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So David is still God's anointed king, but David seems here to be recognizing that the people have chosen someone else, have chosen Absalom. It is quite interesting because if we look right back, I mean, back in Kings, I haven't actually got the reference here, back in Kings, we see how David had actually promised Bathsheba that her son Solomon would be king. So in his mind, David has already set aside that Solomon would be king, but here Absalom, the older half brother, is kind of being acknowledged by David. Okay, verses 19 to 22 there's one person mentioned in particular, Ittai the Gittite. What do we learn about Ittai?
He's only just turned up like the day before. But he's willing to stay with David, isn't he? He seems very loyal, despite the fact that he's only just pitched up, really.
Right. And what does he want to do for David?
Wants to go with him.
He wants to go with David, doesn't he? And why? What's the reasons for that?
Well, he'd got 600 men with him.
Uh-huh. And okay, so what does David want? What does David say to him? David still, the king here is referring to David. The King David, what did David say to him?
He said he'd be better off going back under King Absalom.
He did, didn't he?
He'd be more comfortable there rather than dragging all his people around in exile, wandering around. Whereas he replies and says, actually, no, I acknowledge you as king. And he's prepared, whether it means life or death, he's prepared to give up a lot, isn't he, for King David?
Yeah, he is, isn't he? And he says, as in verse 21, as surely as the Lord lives, and as my Lord the King David lives, wherever my Lord the King may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be. Wow.
Mm.
And when I was thinking about that, it was reminding me actually of those of us who were in church yesterday, Andy talking about the pearl of great price. You know, this man here was prepared to give up everything he'd got to follow David, because he and his God, because he obviously believed that was where, we don't know, do we, not exactly what it was, that there's something he's seen in David and in his service of God that makes him want to be with David, come what may. What an amazing man.
It's a slight reminder of Ruth, isn't it? Ruth and Naomi. Your God will be my God, and where you go, I will go.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you remember that with Ruth when she said that to Naomi, didn't she? That she was going to leave her own people and she was going to follow Naomi and her God. And this is exactly that similar sort of thing. And as I say, those people, they're not Israelites, but if they want to follow God, God accepts them. And it's a kind of picture of when we get to New Testament times, of when the Gentiles were accepted into the Jewish, and the old covenant was done away with, and Jesus came in those days, came for everyone. Yeah, so that was a sort of picture of what was to come. Yeah, and I thought it reminded me of Ruth as well. Okay, so we're up to verse 24, and where we get to where the king says that the king and his followers crossed over the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley is to the east of Jerusalem. It's a great big valley that goes across to the Mount of Olives, which then goes up a big hill. I don't know if any of you've been there, but it's a big hill that goes up, and you can get to the top and look back and see the view of Jerusalem. Yeah. So when they cross the Kidron Valley, who meets them there?
The priest.
Okay, which there's two priests, I think. Who are they?
Zadok.
Zadok is one of them. Yeah.
Abiathar.
Abiathar, yeah, Abiathar. And they're priests. And what have they brought with them?
They brought the Ark of the Covenant of God.
Okay, and what did the Ark? Sorry, Margaret, go on.
Symbolise God's presence.
Thank you. Yes, they brought the Ark of the God with them to symbolise the presence of God there. They'd taken it from Jerusalem and brought it, well, just outside here to meet David. And verse 25 and 20, well, verse 25 first. What does David ask them to do?
Take it into the city.
Yeah. He asked them, doesn't he, to return the ark back to Jerusalem. Yeah, take it back there. Yeah.
It was going to be a symbol as to whether he was accepted or not.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So he doesn't want to hold on to the ark as the symbol of his kingship, if you like. He was prepared to send it back and let God. His trust was in God, not in the ark, as in the past times they used to use the ark as sort of being a powerful thing. Well, David wanted the ark in its rightful place in Jerusalem because he knew that God would. He says he knew God would be looking after him. So. Right, so these two priests, Zadok and Abiathar, are asked to go back to Jerusalem, and they're asked to take with them their two sons, another Ahimaaz, and another, and this is Abiathar's son Jonathan. It's obviously a different Jonathan to the one who died in battle, before, but another Jonathan. So these four people go back to Jerusalem. Okay, and verse 28, what was to be the role of these people when they've gone back? Let's see what they're doing.
They've got to come back and tell me what's going on.
So what are they really being sent back to Jerusalem to do?
Spy.
Thank you, Joy. Yes, they are embedded spies, aren't they? Being sent back to Jerusalem so that David can find out what's going on there. The plot, it's quite a good plot, really, to do this. Yeah. Okay, so in the final section, then we're down to verse 30 to 37. Another volunteer to read?
Yes, I don't mind.
Thank you.
But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told Ahithophel is among conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. When David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, "If you go with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their two sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear." So David's friend Hushai arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city.
Okay, thank you. So having crossed the Kidron Valley, we see that David goes across to the Mount of Olives. Try and picture the scene of description we've got here. How would we, what is it? What describe the scene? What would you say?
And David was very distressed. He was weeping and his head was covered and he was barefoot. He was very distressed.
Very distressed, yeah. And to capital, what does he learn has happened to his senior trusted advisor?
That his
Ahithophel is among the conspirators and he's gone over to Absalom.
Okay. Yeah, so his friend and advisor has departed from David and gone to Absalom. So what does David pray? Verse 31.
He said, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness."
Okay, yeah. He asked God to frustrate this person's advice. Yeah, he's like, he's gone over to the side, you know. I love David. He's always so honest with God, isn't he? His feelings, they come out, you know. And David goes up to the summit, and who does he meet?
Hushai the Archite.
Hushai, the Archite.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Hushai, we'll call him, shall we? Another advisor, Hushai up at the top there, looking somewhat dishevelled, suddenly arrives. So David's made this prayer, and suddenly up the top there, someone else has turned up. And how, in verse 37, how is Hushai described?
He was a friend.
As David's friend. So here's David escaped, he's in despair, he's weeping, and he prays this prayer, and then he gets up the mountain, and there's his friend Hushai there. Is that God's planning in that? Do you see God's hand in, you know, bringing that person for David at that moment?
He'd be a good spy. He'd be a good spy on behalf of David, you know, to get all the information, what was going on with Absalom.
I think that's right. I think we see that's what's going to happen, isn't it? Because what's David planning? In verses 32 to 37, Margaret says he's going to use Hushai as a spy. He's asking him to go back to the palace. So he's got insiders there who will keep him up to date with Absalom's plans. So despite everything, we see God's hand, don't we, in the plans, as Hushai is now safely inside Jerusalem, as just before the self-proclaimed King Absalom arrives in Jerusalem. As it says at the very end there, Hushai, David's confidant, arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. So again, in that, the planning, the timing, you know, in God's hands is just absolutely, you know, it's there, isn't it? And before I just wanted to point out to you that, as I've done before, that this, what we're reading now is like the history of David. It's what he did. It says, you know, what happened next. But amazingly, in the Bible, we have an insight into what David was thinking. Because David kept a journal, didn't he? He used to write down how he was feeling. He used to write down his prayers. And some of these he can track to particular times in his life. And I'm going to read to you Psalm 3, which you can look up if you want, but it's titled here, A Psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. So this is an insight, you know, what David maybe wrote that night or the next night. He wrote this down because this was pouring out his heart as to how he felt before God. And this is what it says in Psalm 3. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. So that's a little insight there, isn't it, into that. And another one that you might want to read in your own time is Psalm 63, again, written at this time, and you could look that up perhaps later and just see how David determined in his mind to hang on to his God in, humanly speaking, difficult, depressing circumstances. And he decides, doesn't he, that although he's got treachery around him, friends who let him down, a son who has taken his own kingship, and yet he describes God as a shield around him. He hides in the knowledge that God is looking after him. And that's a real, I think, insight into the person of David, who he is and his relationship with God. And I think we can use the Psalms ourselves, can't we? When we're feeling down, let us turn to them, because the truths in there about God are just as true for us as they were, as they were when, the God that David found and worshipped is the same God today, and we can turn to him as well. Just in closing, what I just wanted just to say this, that we think of David there walking up the Mount of Olives, and as king he's been rejected, dejected. He'd been anointed by God, but is no longer recognised by many people as king. I wonder what that might remind us of. Mount of Olives. Because King Jesus also walked on the Mount of Olives. He was God's Messiah. And he was hailed one day as the king. And then a few days later, he was rejected and crucified. And while we remember that King David was suffering as a fulfillment of prophecy, the fulfillment that he was suffering for the sins that he had himself committed, we know that King Jesus had committed no sins. And instead he was suffering, wasn't he, for our sins, that we might be forgiven, that we might be reconciled to God. So I think that, again, is a wonderful picture of how the Old Testament points forward to what is to come. We just, so I just wanted to leave it with those thoughts, really, unless anyone's got anything they particularly want to add. Okay, well, I'll hand back to Carol then. And
thank you for that, Sue, because that was quite a good chapter, really, wasn't it? There was quite a lot going on there, wasn't there? But that sort of reminder that, looking at that Psalm 3, that the Lord sustained, David acknowledged that it was the Lord that sustained him. Again, he's on the run, isn't he? He's done that so many times when he was running from Saul. But he turns to the Lord, and I think that's a really great reminder, isn't it, as to what we should do. It's the Lord we should look to as well, because it is God who sustains us as well. So we're going to have a bit of time of prayer. I'm just going to stop the recording. Stop